This podcast is also available via stagelink.com, the groundbreaking new platform for live performing arts. Please support the podcast by liking, subscribing, commenting, and tagging the podcast. It helps us to continue to bring the industry high-level content. I'm your host, Shanae Stiletto, and my guest on today's Circuspreneur podcast is Dr. Melanie Stuckey. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Melanie.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with you talking today.
Oh, I'm so just thrilled to have you here today. For listeners, I'm going to probably go in and out of calling Dr. Melanie, and Dr. Melanie out of respect. But I want to give you a little bit of background about Dr. Melanie Stuckey. She is a researcher in human performance and social innovation at HUPR, Human Potential Research Center, affiliated with the National Circus School in Montreal. I'm sure a few of you have heard about that out there. Some of us have. Her main focus is on factors affecting human performance through the lens of inclusive, holistic well-being, alongside social innovation to support the flourishing of individuals and communities. Melanie is the co-editor-in-chief of the Circus, Arts, Life, and Sciences Journal. She's a member of the Surveillance of Injuries for Research on Circus, or CIRC, working group, and a member of the Canadian College Research Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Community of Practice Planning Committee. She's also a former pole dance and circus artist and coach. A little bit about Melanie's papers that she's had published and research and data that she'll be discussing today. Mental health has received little attention in pre-professional and professional circus despite the performance demands, cognitive skill, and emotional labor required. This review aimed to consolidate the literature, identify research gaps, and guide practice priorities for mental health in pre-professional and professional circus artists. That is what we are here to discuss today, Melanie, and what you presented recently at PAMA, or the Performing Arts Medicine Association conference in Washington, D.C., where we were both on the circus panel led by Stephanie Greenspan, which was absolutely fantastic. We had an amazing time there, and I was so honored to advocate alongside you and Stephanie and Janine Stoop, who is also just absolutely phenomenal. And she heads, I believe, the Pearl Research Lab. And for those out there that know of Dr. Stephanie Greenspan, she heads athletic science. So I would love to dive in, Melanie, into your experience and, kind of putting this work out there at PAMA recently.
Yeah, so for starters, I will not so humbly say we had an incredible group presenting together at PAMA. And I want to just mention them at first as well, like you already gave a little introduction to them. But one of the reasons why this group was so important is because, Janine was talking about the physical health impacts. Stephanie was going a little bit more specific into concussion. Of course, you were there talking about the artist and the advocacy side. And then I was there talking about mental health. And the reason why I think it was so powerful to have all four of us together is yes, we'll talk about mental health today, but mental health doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of all the physical things that are going on, specific, perhaps concussions, but specific events or illnesses. And then in the whole context of there's actually artists that are living this life every day. And so it's not just a matter of sitting behind our desks and reading some papers. We really need to be thinking about how this actually transfers and impacts into actual people's real lives and into the circus context as it is. So of course, there's always going to be that theoretical, yes, it would be perfect if we could do this and we could do this and we could do this. And some of the things we'll talk about today will probably be at that theoretical level. And then what we actually need is to have more discussions with people who are really doing it so that we can take what theoretically might be perfect and then actually integrate it in a way that's usable in real life.
Yes. And I love that aspect that you speak about so much, Melanie, of how does this research and this data land in real life. And that is where I come in terms of policy and legislation, because you have the data, you have the research, and it's like it supports our arguments, right? And having folks like you that are taking the time, there's not that much research out there with respect to mental health and respect to so much of the circus arts industry, which makes it challenging when we are trying to prove our arguments, even though we all know we're living this. This is super prevalent within the industry. We also, you have all done a really great job in utilizing other streams of thought and other kind of research that's out there to base that off of the circus arts, or kind of like use them in tandem. As I would say, kind of like a springboard of like, this is very similar environment, and this is where they've done and conducted that data, and this is how it's similar, and this is how it is not similar, and this is how it doesn't work, and this is the specific nuance that we need to continue to pursue, so that our data is just as relevant as the data that we see for so many environments. That there's a ton of papers out there that get published, and a ton of things that come up as census and things like that. And correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm using a little bit of incorrect language here, Melanie, but it's so important. And having you in the room when we were advocating for policy, also too, in Washington D.C., we went to Capitol Hill together, and we also too met with some senators in Washington D.C. to again bring them this, because D.C. loves data, they love numbers, they love a report, and they love again to see that there are folks behind the scenes that are paying attention to these very minute details, because that is what matters to those certain demographics and environments. So it was really profound and important to have you there producing that and showing, again, what relevant research we have in America for circus arts, and then also to what is going and what is happening in Canada, which is where you're based, and is where you're basing some, but not all of your research, right?
Right. Yeah. And so to put it into perspective, maybe with a few more numbers, our mental health review, so the one that you introduced at the beginning just a few minutes ago, was based on the International Olympic Committee's mental health consensus for elite athletes. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But we were hoping to do a similar consensus for circus and the sport. So the elite athletes in their entire thing, I don't remember the exact number, but they had somewhere over 600 or 700 research articles that they based their consensus on.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's incredible that they have so much. In
Yeah.
circus, we had 16. So it's
Wow.
very small, and three of those were intervention studies. One was only a proposal of an intervention, one was a case study, and one was something that had actually carried out an intervention. And perhaps one of the worrisome things in circus is that we actually don't have any studies about pharmacological data or medication. So what effects do medications for mental illnesses actually have? And we know from other data from just mental health or sport that some of them can have significant effects on things like reaction time, fatigue, body composition, things that are important in daily circus practice. And so it would be very helpful to have a better understanding of when circus artists are prescribed these medications or taking these medications. Is there a way that we need to adjust training? Is there a way we need to adjust performance? Is there something we can do to support them better so that they can have optimal mental health and optimal performance at the same time?
Right, because both of them go hand in hand. And I think that so much within circus, people really forget that aspect of it, that you have these very emotional spaces that are doing this high level, dangerous technical skill. And where does that support come from? Not everybody has access to mental health, providers. Not everyone has insurance. Most jobs and most shows don't have anyone on site to be able to support their performers, even even in long-term shows, or if you're doing some type of residency. And then there's also too sometimes the fear around, if I divulge too much about my mental state, will I be able to continue my job? And I think that again speaks back to why I think mental health ends up being maybe even more acute because you have so many different extenuating factors that go into how we operate on a daily basis when we're doing performances. I love in the paper, it talks about the fear of performing and the fear of learning the skills also too, versus the fear of having to perform them every single day, and how those things are also too incredibly different. Which one creates more mental health stress for the performer? And looking at the nuance of that, I thought was like really, really fascinating and interesting. because I know even for myself how I have felt many times over the years in terms of you just have to make it to the stage. You just got to get there. You just got to find some way to come back to your body and to concentrate without anybody really there being able to help shape and mold my perspective or my mental state when going into, my performances. And it doesn't mean that there is anything wrong with you. These are things that so many of us have been dealing with our entire lives. And unless you're seeking that support out by yourself, you're probably most likely not going to get it at your job. And why do you think that is, Melanie, that we don't have structures as of yet
Uh-huh.
in the circus arts where we support the mental health of the artist in the way that we can? Not saying that people don't and that there's not environments that are trying to do to move the needle on that. But, I would say across the board and the majority, it's the exception and it's not the rule at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And the why is probably mostly related to the size of companies and the money that's available in circus versus when you think about sports. And just quickly before I jump into this, I'm just going to mention that when we talk about mental health and sort of the psychological side of things, there's really three different things we're talking about. So there's mental health, which is, how well you feel on a given day mentally. There's mental performance, which is how you're ready to perform. So some of those things like being able to overcome anxiety of performing, how you're able to be sharp and focused and confident going onto stage or training. It doesn't have to be a performer. And then there's mental illness. So that's when you have a diagnosed mental illness, which it's nice that it's actually separate from mental health. So
Mm-hmm.
you can have someone who has a mental illness, but a really high level of mental health and mental performance. And so they'd be considered to be flourishing in life. And then you can have someone that does not have a mental illness, but has really low mental health and really low levels of mental performance. So they would be considered to be languishing in life. And most often you have someone somewhere in the middle.
Could
But
you
then,
provide an example, Melanie, of someone that a mental illness that would go hand in hand with someone that is functioning highly,
mhm.
in their mental health, but does have a mental illness that would maybe be specific to the circus arts?
Sorry, an example?
Yeah, an example of a mental illness while also high functioning. Mm-hmm.
Oh, so pretty
Yeah.
much for any mental illness you have, and just for like a little bit of background, before I started working in circus, I worked in a recovery-oriented mental health hospital. And so the idea of recovery-based treatment is essentially that people are independent from their illness. So despite having symptoms that you may have to manage for a long time, you can still thrive in life.
Right. So even if
Um,
you have like ADHD, for example, you can still be a
exactly.
high functioning circus artist. Or
Absolutely. If you have
Mhm.
ADHD, if you have depression, if you have anxiety, if you have schizophrenia,
Mhm.
bipolar disorder, anything that you can be diagnosed with, you can still have those symptoms really well managed and have a really high level of mental health. And then
Mhm.
on the other side of that, you can have no mental illness and have really low mental health and still be struggling. And
Right.
also, the reason I bring that up is because there's this very specific type of person who has a very specific degree and medical ability to treat people who have mental illnesses. And then there's something that people who are not psychologists or psychiatrists can also be able to just put supports in for mental health. And so I feel like I didn't say that in a very clear and concise way, but essentially, when we're looking at the circus context, yes, there are going to be people who have mental illnesses who need to be followed by their psychologist, their psychiatrist,
Mhm.
whoever their medical care team would be.
Mhm.
And that might be something that they just always needs to be referred out. I'm not sure. But then there's also specialists who work on mental performance, and this is huge in the sport world. I know Cirque du Soleil also has some mental performance specialists, I believe is their proper title. It might be a bit different than that, but people who are there to support. Well, in the sport world, athletes, in the circus world, artists, to specifically support them to build their focus, to be able to just be mentally ready to perform, mentally ready to train, and be able to train at that high level. And then we can also have just like more of a general population who can be thoughtful about mental health and thoughtful about things like stress and not anxiety disorder, but worry and emotions in general, and how can we be creating environments that really support people to be able to express, regulate, and deal with those normal human emotions that impact our mental health so much.
That we often, think in circus, like, we don't have, real, issues or real problems. That's, I think, sometimes the misconception, the myth
Mhm.
within our industry, that we
Yeah.
don't have issues with mental health, that you do kind of do whatever it takes just to get along and to be there. You even speak about, Melanie, in your papers that have been published about, eating disorders and, things of that nature that are all, I think, symptoms of a larger problem in terms of how we effectually do not address these issues within our industry. And you have to be in, I think, an environment that is, very well maintained, but also too, a lot of that is very isolated. I think we discussed that as well too, about if there are methods and things that are being done that are better for artists, they're not things that come into the overall environment. They can be very isolated and very singular. And the push at this point for like policy is to make sure that everyone has access to these benefits. So how can we get these benefits, accessible across the board? And can you talk about kind of the inaccessibility of, having access to mental health benefits within the circus arts as a circus artist or even as a circus program? Maybe kind of like the roadblocks to being able to do those things in the way that certain spaces would like to do them.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's also, I mean, I would say that's a very tough question, because there are, um, I mean, some of it is policy based. So it's just a matter of um, there being that push at the policy level of, if nobody's implementing it, who's going to push for it, and who's going to, thank you, Shanae, try and get these things passed, and so that it is a standard across. And part of it is also, I would say, just believing in what can be different. I know at
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
at ENC, at the National Circus School, we've had a lot of talks, especially since the pandemic 2020, when mental health issues kind of had a little bit of a spike. And so we've been mindful about people's mental health more, and what can we do. And it's not as cut and dry. Like, it seems like it should be so easy to just bring it in, but a lot of
Mhm.
it also comes down to the culture. So even if you have administration, and if they put in all the supports possible, if we get extra social workers and have our student services person who's ready to support everyone, there still has to be a willingness and an acceptability in the culture, so that the students are willing to speak about it and take action on it. And how do we really create that culture where, I guess, perhaps starting from a very young age, or through each level that people move up, right? Like, people don't come to your school, or people don't enter your company as a blank slate. They already have all of these beliefs that have been deeply, deeply ingrained in them. And so if they've come from a space where you don't talk about mental health, and poor mental health is weakness, and strong people don't feel their feelings, and blah, 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 that
Yeah,
stuff that we really need to
right.
overcome, that's what they're coming in with. So how are you purposefully and consciously trying to change that conversation, and make sort of shift those beliefs, and be a culture where it's different?
And how have you gone about, I would say, assessing this data and this research, and how challenging has it been, Melanie, to try and research this particular aspect of the circus arts industry? Like, I know
Yeah.
these are like
So
really hard questions. You're like, how hard has it been? I mean, how much time have you
yeah.
got?
I mean, the easy answer to that is it's extremely challenging, because it costs money, and you need a
Mhm.
grant to do it. And if there aren't granting agencies who are really willing to, and I don't want to say there's not granting agencies who don't think it's important, but when you think
Mhm.
about circus is such a small niche, and when you're applying for a grant and people see circus, they're like, oh, that's fun, but there's something more important that needs it, or like something bigger.
Mhm.
Because a lot of times when you're submitting a grant too, you have to, like, for me being in Canada, it's a matter of, like, how is this going to impact your community? How will it impact all of Canada? And when you're like, well, all the circus artists across Canada, and people are like, oh, like, so it's hard to, as much as us in the industry know how important it is, it's hard to make the case at that federal level of federal funding that like this is going to have a big impact on people, even if it's a niche area of people.
Right.
So how do we get more funding so that we can run the research is really the big question. And I do not have the answer to that, or I would have done it already.
Well, I think you have a lot of answers though, and even with it being so difficult, you are publishing so many papers and getting so much work done and putting so much out there. So, with the work that you are doing, I know that it's exceptionally difficult, and we go back and forth in conversation about this all the time about the challenges that we're facing, and even in Canada, where it's like, is it a niche at this point anymore? I mean, it's huge. It's a huge, huge, huge thing, and I think it's really fascinating to get that feedback that we still get, where you think like, wow, we still don't seem important, but we are generating quite a bit of economic income here. We're employing a lot of people, even across Canada, and how challenging, even still that is even now in 2025. And then the conversation of, how do we continue to make that relevant? How do we continue to make our industry important and a focal point of where people are at? And that's the policy issue as well here in America of how can we keep circus arts at the forefront of what they're thinking of in terms of shaping these policies with what we actually need. And I also wanted you to speak to that, Melanie, of being in spaces and providing that data so that folks understand specifically what we need, because so many times our environments, I think, are shaped by folks outside of the industry and that don't know very much. And what we're usually saying as well and if you would fund more of this data, you'd be able to have and use even more of it to help you make those decisions. And that's why I really want us to continue to have a seat at the table, so that when we are there, we're in the room, and these things are not shaped without our perspectives, and then they don't support us because they don't have the important nuance of what makes our industry tick. So, if you could speak on that a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I'm going to address that 100%. So feel free to cut me off and do what you need to do. But I think that there's sort of a couple of steps to that. And the one is from the researcher end, to be able to sort of engage in more of a co-creation with artists, right? Whether it's artists or companies, schools, whatever it is, right from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So it can be great. Like I can sit down and I can read all the papers, all 16 papers that have been published in mental health and circus. And I can see all of the gaps really easily. And I can say like, this should be done, and this should be done, and this should be done, and this should be done. Like I can have a huge list. But until that comes into conversation with the people who are going to be using the research directly, it's hard to know what's going to be actually useful, what's going to address the greatest need at the moment. And of course, we need people to engage in our research, because not everything is theory. So we need to be getting data from people. And so we want to be getting data that is important to them, that's going to give them the greatest feedback and the greatest outcomes, hopefully after anyway. So there's sort of that one step where we need to be actually talking to artists, schools, the people, to be able to do our research as best as we can, or in a more meaningful way. And then there's also the other side of things is once we have research, how do we translate that back? So how do we say like, okay, thanks, you told us what you needed. We see this is the outcome. And how do we feed that back into the industry again, in a way that's meaningful for them to use? And then also feed that research forward into people who are interested in potentially changing policy, or how do we get that to the people? And I think I just asked the same question that you asked. And I think the answer is that I don't have an answer, but those are the two spots that we really need to be focused. First, do research that's actually meaningful. And then, maybe even if I know one of the sort of groups of people that we've been thinking have been missed a lot. Like I think we're pretty good. Janine is with Pearl Research, and they work directly with the program there. David Monroe is with NICA, and they work directly with the program there. I'm with ENC. We work with the program here. But I think that when we talk about mental health and physical health, one of the groups of stakeholders that we've really had challenges engaging with is like company directors, artistic directors, the people who make budgetary decisions essentially for companies. And when we get to that executive level, what is actually important to them? Do they care if the students at ENC have a lot of stress, or do they care that they're going to be performing well and costing them as little money as possible once they get there? I'm not trying to say that it's as that black and white and they're, but they have their responsibilities as an
Right.
executive team. And so I think that's one group that we would really love to engage with more in the future to find out how we can actually be addressing their needs, because we also know that they aren't living in this perfect world where they have no problems either. And so there are needs that need to be addressed for them. And certainly all of the things around artist mental health, artist physical health, so many of these policy things would be able to support them better too. And how do we make that connection so that we can have like not only meaningful research for people who are going through training and students, but then it actually transfers into the industry after.
Right, that pipeline, which is so essential and so important. And I love that you spoke about who we need to be engaging with more and who needs to be within the conversations more, and the economic bottom lines for a lot of spaces, and how can we show them that if you support these other things that are very important, that it'll, I think, help the overall economic bottom line. And we've seen that. I mean, they've seen that with so many different industries, where if you give your workers and you give your employees more benefits, that it actually encourages their work and they perform better, and you spend a lot less money on other budgetary things that are non-essential, and that it creates an overall better working environment. People get along better. I'm sure that would probably be for our industry, probably maybe less interpersonal fighting, less accidents. I think we can definitely all at this point in time speak to that, even if there is not like pronounced data effectively around that. But I think that from even the data that you guys all have, and from the conclusions that you've made, and just from our experiences, we know that that could probably shape this industry and make things a lot better, even if at the onset it doesn't seem like it would, because folks think that things are just too expensive. And I think changing that narrative around the circus arts industry is what is going to continue to be, I think, the fight around that, especially because our industry is so precarious, and it is so dangerous. And I think it's interesting when we have to discuss about taking care of and maintaining mental health within an environment that's highly stressful. You would think that you would want every single effective person within that environment. And, we also spoke about a little bit, Melanie, I don't want to veer too much off of your research, but in terms of the certifications and the experiences of those that are shaping artists, and how that needs to change. And we definitely need to be looking at that in terms of policy too, of, are folks equipped enough to be coaching and training in these environments, and do they need better tools, which I think they very much need to. And I think that comes into our degree programs, and having higher levels of education when you are in environments that are so dangerous and so acutely specialized, but that have now become so popular, and it makes it difficult to control that. And I think that that's also a reason as well that we need to continue to work towards.
100%. And yeah, we definitely talked about how a lot of certifications are kind of weekend certifications that you go for a weekend and then you know everything you need to know. I know it's,
Everything.
yeah, everything. I know I had to take a few pole certifications, and we learned nothing about, I mean, a pole is fairly secure because it's, fully usually screwed into the roof and the ceiling. But we learn nothing about how do you know if a pole is safe or not? Is there something you should be watching for the bend, or how do you know when it's time to take down a pole and replace it? And I think in some of the circus ones, you don't actually learn what makes a rigging point safe. It's just, here's some moves you can teach some people, and that's all great. And I think I'm speaking more so from the Canadian perspective, and certainly this is not about the coaches at ENC, because all of our coaches are very professional career coaches, but looking at a lot of the more recreational programs,
Mhm.
there's
Yeah.
not necessarily a standard for
Right.
um, for training, and they're often considered to be like a hobby job, right? So it's just something you
Mhm.
kind of do on the side. You really love circus, and so of course you want to teach it.
Right.
Maybe you have a full-time job and you're just going to teach a couple of things, so we can't really ask you to go to all this extra training and know about rigging points and know about all these things. That's just ridiculous when you're only teaching a couple of classes a week. Um, and while it may seem ridiculous for only teaching a couple of classes a week, is it ridiculous when you're teaching a bunch of people to climb up however many feet in the air and hang upside down and wrap themselves up maybe and fall down and hope that they've put their wraps in the right direction, that they get caught? Um, so there's a lot that goes into circus, and that's only like one apparatus. We didn't even get into like hand to hand or anything else. But there
Mhm.
is so much, and there is, I think, outside of like the professional circus schools or very high level. Um, I think there's a lot of just the view of coaching as a hobby,
Mhm.
and I think that's where we really need to be starting to think a bit more about how would we like to have professionals who are really treated like professionals, and not to say that the people teaching, like some of them are absolutely professional, they go to tons of con ed, they do tons of reading, they stay on the top of their game, but it doesn't, they're still not treated like professionals and reimbursed as if they're professionals, and have the expectations that you would think that any other career having the same. Like, can you imagine if a roofer had the same criteria? Like, they have to do so much training for their
Yeah.
I'm sure in the US as well, they have to do so much training to be able to be in their harness up on the roof. And why is that so different than a circus coach? So
Right. And I think also too, I love what you were discussing, Melanie. Also, even if somebody is a hobbyist or in maybe a program that is not initially serious, that your students eventually could become serious students and they could end up going to a serious higher education circus school. And so I think that we've seen that as well, where people start as hobbyists, it's not that serious, and then they end up in a very serious job that they are not ready for. And I've heard that many, many, many times in terms of the stress on folks and artists and coaches in terms of mental health, because they're like, they just weren't ready. Like they didn't expect to get this opportunity and they're happy, they're grateful, all the things. But then you realize, whoa, I didn't come from this particular school of thought, but now I'm in this big league. And now I need a lot of extra support to protect myself. And so I think it's what we're saying too about like that development being treated as serious within any of these environments, because in our industry it is different. You never know, you might go from a hobbyist in 1 year and then suddenly you are working for Cirque du Soleil in the next 2 years, and it was not your plan whatsoever. And I think that the crossover that happens within our industry is much more likely than some other industries, which again I think speaks to like the nuance of how it's just specific, and it doesn't make it good or bad. It's just looking at the reality of those things, and then again what leads to maybe certain accidents happen that maybe could have been avoided if folks were more prepared, or there was more structure or certifications, or more energy or efforts paid to them in those different environments that eventually took them into something that again they just weren't prepared for. And it's not about making it anyone's fault, it's just how do we influence these structures and make them more supportive, so that we're thinking about how this industry works, and not just kind of leaving people out there to fend for themselves and then blame them when something does happen or something does go wrong. We are going to be ending the podcast soon, Melanie. And so thank you so much for coming on and sharing just your brilliant research. You are so brilliant and concise, and you speak about research in a way that anyone could understand because you're speaking about so many different nuanced things. And I highly recommend everyone go, and follow Melanie and read her papers. I'm going to put a couple of them in the show notes so that you can read the papers that they have had published recently. But what would you like to leave us with, Dr. Melanie, in in terms of where do you think the gaps that we need to continuously fill in for mental health and things that you are looking towards for continued research around mental health in the circus arts for pre-professionals and professionals in the industry?
Yeah. Oh, this is going to take the next half hour. No, I'm kidding.
You got
I
2 minutes.
think that's okay. I can do 2 minutes. I think for me, there's two major pieces to mental health that I would love to see just, I don't even know if addressed more, but more consciously thought about. One is the emotional labor. So really considering, and we've talked about it, I just gave it a different name, but the idea of like having to perform emotions and being scared and having to deal with risk and all of those things. And the other is body capital, which I think is a really big contributor to mental health, and we often forget about. And yes, body image is a part of that, and that's quite huge when we think about eating disorders and stuff like that in the circus world. But also just the idea that you are constantly being paid as a professional artist and expected to have a functioning body and to have a body that functions in a certain way and can do things, and just the stress that that can have on a person from always being an object and always being a product. And that can have quite a big impact on it as well, without having that ability to like step away and let something else take your spotlight for a little while or whatnot. And so I think that just I would love to see there be more awareness about all of the issues that contribute to mental health in circus. And once we get the awareness, then I think we can really start diving in and focusing on very specific interventions to help to improve mental health in our circus artists and our circus industry. And just one quick addition on your last point about the training is I feel like whether you're a hobbyist and whether you stay a hobbyist for your whole life, is it ever going to be bad to have more training on risk management, emotional regulation, and just being confident and joyful? So I think, and like interpersonal competencies, interpersonal relationships, I feel like those are beneficial to everyone, whether they're like crucial to a professional artist, but they're beneficial to everyone. So there's no reason why we can't be integrating all of that from hobbyists forward.
Yes. I 1000% agree on that. And I think that that is a brilliant note to end on, Dr. Melanie. Thank you again for coming on and for sharing your amazing work. And we'll continue to, follow your journey and report back on the valuable research and data that you're doing. And folks that want to collaborate with Melanie, she is a brilliant mind, and I love the work that she's doing. And I'm very happy to be a part of it and working and being included and trying again to be on the policy side of how do we utilize this research and data and how do we make it exist and live in the real world, so that it is mandated and and everyone can have access to it in the way that is specific to them within the circus arts, specifically in America, and then everyone that's working to do that at large, so that we have that on an international basis as well, because the industry is an international community and industry. And you might be working in America today, but you also might be working in Canada tomorrow. And then the next week, you might also too be working in the Netherlands. That's just the way that our industry ticks. So having all of this cohesive data and research and opinions and perspectives that are cohesive across the board is so important, that so many of us are on the same page of how, we're supporting the industry. This Circuspreneur podcast is also available on stagelink.com, stagelync.com, the groundbreaking new platform for live performing arts that provides unmatched access and connection to this vibrant world of shows and entertainment. If you're a professional in the performing arts, visit stagelink.com/pro. StageLink Pro, StageLyncPro, offers industry professionals higher visibility, networking opportunities, and tools to support and enhance their careers. Until next time, everyone, I'm your host, Shanae Stiletto. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and please tune in for the next episode of the Circuspreneur podcast.